All right, good morning, AKF. So this morning, this is part 2 on why I changed my mind on the Septuagint. Now, one of the things that I truly enjoy doing, right, something that just energizes me, is I love nerding out on complex topics and then explaining them to people in a way that's easy to digest and understand. Now, this is received well for the most part, which is why I continue to do it, but occasionally there are those who really understand the topic that I'm talking about, meaning at the same level as I do, usually more than I do, and they give me feedback and they criticize me for leaving out details. Now, that's the nature of the beast, unfortunately, because if I included those details, it would no longer serve the purpose that it does, which is making it easy to understand and easy to digest. So I won't be able to please everyone. If you enjoy what we are going to dive into today, and you want to nerd out on this topic as well, I would recommend that you look up Henry B. Smith Jr. Henry B. Smith Jr. He is with the Associates of Biblical Research. Henry, believe it or not, has spent 7 or 8 years studying and researching the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11. Let that sink in. 7 or 8 years studying the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11. It's incredible, right? By the way, this is exposing one of my secrets. I find people who have studied a particular issue for their entire life or for a long period of time, and I learn from them. As much as I would love to spend years and years of time studying or researching something in particular, I personally have way too many interests and projects to go that deep on idiosyncratic and esoteric issues. And so, in my opinion, this is the next best thing, right? Find someone who has dedicated their life or many years of their life on an issue and learn from them. And of course, when you read their material and when you watch their videos, you're never going to understand it like they do, but boy, will you benefit from their hard work, and it will save you a lot of time. Now, what we learned in part 1 most likely caused a couple different reactions based on the type of personality that you have individually. The first type of personality, you probably felt a little bit of discomfort and maybe even some insecurity in the idea that the texts which underlie our Bible are not clear-cut. Now, I totally get it. I get that reaction. It feels good to think that everything is just all buttoned up and that our Bible, specifically the Old Testament in this series, is based on a Hebrew text that perfectly represents the original manuscripts. I get it. Now, the second type of person, and this is me, which is why I'm doing the series, gets excited at the thought of new discoveries and digging deep, looking for the equivalent of modern day buried treasure. I get energized at the thought that we can maybe get closer to the original Hebrew manuscripts through something like the Septuagint. This excites me so much, I become like Indiana Jones in search of the lost ark. So, hang in there if this makes you a little uneasy, and I think you will feel better when we are done, because we won't just be uncovering issues along the way, but we will also be solving problems as well. So, in our last message, we discovered that Canaan in the Luke 3 genealogy was missing from the genealogy in Genesis chapter 11. Now, Canaan is really not that important, okay? The purpose of bringing him up was simply to lay the groundwork for what we are going to be discussing, and that's a conversation concerning textual criticism of the Old Testament and the Septuagint. Now, there are some significant differences between the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint, and I would not consider this guy Canaan a significant difference. But Canaan did serve as a great introduction to the topic, as he is in all English versions, every single English version of Luke 3:36, and he's missing from all English versions of Genesis 11:12, except the Orthodox Study Bible, whose Old Testament is based on the Septuagint. Now, the reason Canaan is missing from all but one of our English version Old Testaments is because they are based on the Hebrew Masoretic text. And Canaan is not in the Hebrew Masoretic text. Now, if Luke originally included Canaan in Luke 3:36, which again, people still debate, the only logical reason is because Luke was using the Septuagint Genesis, which predates the Masoretic text by over 1,000 years, and even predates Christ by over 200 years. And Genesis in the Septuagint includes Canaan. It's a very logical conclusion. So I'd like to move on from Canaan. He was just our introduction to what we're going to be discussing, and that is a very significant difference between the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint, and how I've changed my mind on the Septuagint. I now consider the Septuagint an important resource when it comes to studying the Old Testament, and even when it comes to studying the New Testament and Jesus and the apostles, as the New Testament authors quoted from a Greek Old Testament a lot of the time. Now, we're going to stick with Shem's genealogy in Genesis 11. That's what we discussed last time. But we're going to look at a much bigger difference than the absence of Canaan, and that is the ages of the men in this genealogy. The difference we are about to uncover is very significant, especially because it has the potential to change the age of the earth as believed by many Christians throughout history, including by many Christians today, including myself. Genesis 11:12 again says, Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Shelah. But Genesis 11:12 in the LXX, the Septuagint, says, and Arphaxad lived 135 years and fathered Canaan. Since we covered Canaan in our last message, today we're going to focus on the difference in age here. This is not a subtle difference. Notice the Septuagint says Arphaxad was 135 years old when he begat his son, compared to the Masoretic, which says he was only 35 years old. That's a 100-year difference. Considering the fact that almost no one lives to 100 today, that's a long period of time. And by the way, take note before we continue that this difference here between the texts is exactly 100 years. I think there's a reason for it being precisely 100 years. Skipping to Genesis 11:14, we read, Shelah lived 30 years and begot Eber. And this same verse in the LXX says, and Shelah lived 130 years and fathered Eber. Again, the Septuagint adds exactly 100 years to the age when Shelah fathered his son. Same thing with Genesis 11:16. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg, and Eber lived 134 years and fathered Peleg. An extra 100 years again. And then the same thing with Genesis 11:18 with Peleg and Reu. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu, and Peleg lived 130 years and fathered Reu. And again in Genesis 11:20 with Reu and Serug. Reu lived 32 years and begot Serug, and Reu lived 132 years and fathered Serug. And then one more time in verse 22 with Serug and Nahor. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor, and Serug lived 130 years and begot Nahor. 6 times in a row in Shem's genealogy, we have a difference of exactly 100 years. Something is amiss, right? Well, grab your Indiana Jones fedora. We are about to get our first clue. In verse 24 of Genesis 11, we have another difference in age, but this time it's not 100 years. Genesis 11:24 says, Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah, and Nahor lived 79 years and begot Terah. So we still have a discrepancy here, but this time it's only 50 years instead of the 100 years that we were accustomed to in the previous 6 men in this genealogy. Now, thanks to Tom Berger, who some of you know, for pointing out to me why this is a significant clue as to which genealogy contains the correct ages. Because again, these both can't be right. Either the numbers in the Masoretic are correct or the numbers in the Septuagint are correct, unless you're arguing that they're both wrong, which nobody does. Now, before I tell you what the clue is here, I need to quickly mention that in the academic literature on the genealogies of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, there are 2 competing hypotheses. The first is called the inflation hypothesis, which says that the smaller numbers that we see in the Hebrew were inflated in the Septuagint, meaning they were increased when the Hebrew was translated into Greek. Here's a graphical visual to make sense of this. The inflation hypothesis says that the numbers on the left, the smaller numbers, which we see in the Masoretic text, are the original begetting ages, and that they were increased from what they originally were in the Hebrew to the greater ages in the Greek Septuagint, which are on the right. That's the inflation hypothesis. The second hypothesis, as you could probably figure out, is called the deflation hypothesis, which says that the larger numbers that we see in the Greek Septuagint of Genesis were reduced in the Masoretic Hebrew text, which our English Old Testaments are based on. And here's a graphical representation of the deflation hypothesis, which states that the larger numbers on the left, which we see in the Septuagint, that those are actually the original begetting ages, and that they were reduced from what they originally were in the Septuagint, and that the Septuagint's underlying Hebrew text to the smaller ages which we see in the Masoretic. So the original numbers are found in the Septuagint and the underlying Hebrew text which the Septuagint was translated from and were reduced in the Masoretic. And so you have the inflation hypothesis on the left, you have the deflation hypothesis on the right. Make sense? All right. Getting back to Genesis 11:24. Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah versus Nahor lived 79 years and fathered Terah. Here is why the difference between 29 years and 79 years between the Masoretic and the Septuagint gives us an important clue. If the inflation hypothesis is right, meaning years were added to the smaller numbers, then why not add 100 years to Nahor's 29 years and make Nahor 129 years in the Septuagint? That would follow the same pattern, right? That would be exactly like what happened with the first 6 individuals who went from 35, 30, 34 years old, etc., to 135, 130, 134 years old. To follow that pattern, just make Nahor 129 years old. But that's not what we see here. Instead, Genesis 11:24 in the Septuagint only adds 50 years to Nahor's age, making him 79 years old. This makes perfect sense in the deflation hypothesis, which says that the ages were reduced from the larger numbers. If you wanted to reduce the ages of these men by 100 years each, you would have no issue until you got to Nahor, as all of the previous men all lived longer than 100 years before begetting a specific son. And so when you get to Nahor, who was 79 years old when he begot Terah, since you cannot subtract 100 years from his age, you subtract half of 100 or 50 years from his age, bringing it down to 29 years. Now, I am taking something incredibly complex and I'm simplifying it so that everyone can understand and follow. Hopefully that's been the case so far. By the way, I even want my own kids who are sitting right here in the front row to understand this and be able to follow. But you guys won't have to take the quiz like they will afterward. But something you need to realize, which we don't have time to cover and it makes it way too complicated, is that these 7 differences that we just looked at are not the only age differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. There are many more age differences back in Genesis chapter 5. We haven't even looked at Genesis 5. And there are even more age differences in this chapter, Genesis 11, that we have not covered. And so just these 7 men alone represent a difference of 650 years, right? If 6 men differ by 100 years and 1 by 50 years, that's a 650-year difference just right there. Now, is that significant? Is that worth talking about? I'm going to say absolutely. As someone who calls himself a young earth creationist, you better know something like this is going to grab my attention immediately. You see, if the earth is only about 6,000 years old, according to the chronologies in the Masoretic text, just this one single difference of 650 years from 7 men in Genesis 11, that represents an 11% increase in the age of the earth, just those 7 men. And if it turns out that the other differences in Genesis chapter 5 and the rest in Genesis 11 are indeed accurate in the Septuagint and not in our English Old Testaments, which are based on the Masoretic text, we are looking at closer to a 25% increase in the age of the earth. So this is something we need to take a very careful look at, because being off by 25%, that's a big deal. And that's a big deal in any area of life, not just the age of the earth, right? If you sell something to someone, say your car, for an agreed upon amount, are you going to be okay if they pay you 25% less than what you agreed upon? What if your paycheck is 25% less than what you are owed for the time that you worked? What if someone borrowed money from you and they only pay you back 75%? 25% is very significant. And as you will see, it affects a lot of things here, both biblically and even scientifically. Now, in order for all of this to make sense, we need to have a quick discussion on what are known as external witnesses. In the world of textual criticism, the term external witness refers basically to 2 things. First, a manuscript, and second, those who talked about what they read in the manuscripts that they had at that time. Okay? That's really important. even if we no longer have a manuscript that existed at a particular time, not all hope is lost because we have the writings which reference the manuscripts that existed at that time. That's cool, right? And so in this discussion, since we're going all the way back to Genesis, which is the story of the origins of the world, we're going to have to look at external witnesses that go way back. And so let's go before Christ. Let's start BC. If you want to say BCE, that's fine too. I personally think before Christ's era is a bit redundant, but I'll leave that up to you. So how many external witnesses do we have of the ages of Arphaxad to Nahor BC, before Christ? The answer is 5. We have 5 external witnesses before Christ to the ages of Arphaxad to Nahor. That's stunning. All right, so we're going to, again, look at just these men in Shem's genealogy. Now, the first 2 of the 5 are the Septuagint and the Septuagint's Vorlaga. Don't worry if you've never heard that word, I'll explain it in a second. The Septuagint is an external witness because it is a translation of a Hebrew text. That makes it an external witness itself. And the Septuagint's Vorlaga is that Hebrew text. So that's 2 external witnesses right off the bat. When you're reading academic works, they like to use scholarly and technical words. And I think sadly, a lot of people start to read these academic works, and when they see these words that they don't understand, they just stop reading. And so they don't read academic papers because they don't understand the words. My advice to you is I would encourage you to just look up the words. They seem scary, but once you look them up and you see the definition, it's actually really easy to understand. So Vorlaga, which you're going to find in all of these academic papers, that's just a German word, and in the space of textual criticism, it just means the text that they used to create the new text. That's it. That's what a Vorlaga is. So sometimes the Vorlaga was just a copy of the text that they're copying. It's just a verbatim copy. But other times it would be a translation like the Septuagint, which was translated from Hebrew to Greek. So the Septuagint Vorlaga just means the Hebrew text that they used when they originally translated the Pentateuch into Greek. All right, so this represents the first 2 external witnesses, the Septuagint itself and the Vorlaga, the Hebrew text they translated into Greek. Number 3. Number 3 is Demetrius of Alexander, better known as Demetrius the chronographer. Now, he was a Jewish historian. He was from the 3rd century BC, and the numbers he uses in his works are only consistent with the longer chronology found in the Septuagint. Very important. Number 4 is this guy named Eupolemus. Eupolemus was also a Jewish historian, but he was of the 2nd century BC. But he was also a high-ranking Jerusalem official. Why is this important? As a high-ranking Jerusalem official, he would have never used a Greek chronology that was at odds with the Hebrew texts that he had access to in his position. And check this out. Demetrius and Eupolemus had the exact same creation date of 5307 BC. And that's only workable with the longer chronology of the Septuagint. Finally, number 5, you may have heard of this one. This is the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritan Pentateuch. This is a Hebrew text. It's believed to go all the way back to the 2nd century BC. And as the name implies, the Samaritan Pentateuch is only the first 5 books of the Bible. first 5 books of Moses, and the Hebrew Samaritan Pentateuch has the exact same older begetting ages as the Septuagint, from Arphaxad to Nahor, the exact same. So, I believe that those 5 witnesses that I just mentioned are the only external witnesses of the begetting ages of these men, and all 5 of those witnesses testify to the longer chronology. To be abundantly clear, we have not a single BC witness, not a single one, of the shorter numbers we find in the Masoretic text, the same numbers that you read in your English Bibles today. All right, let's now move to the turn of the millennium, AD, and focus on the 1st century, a very important century in Christian history, of course. We have just one external witness from this time period, someone we are all very familiar with, Flavius Josephus. Now, Josephus, as we know, was another Jewish historian. He was born in Jerusalem in 37 AD, and he is known for his works on 1st century Judaism and early Christianity. He's actually very important to our faith. Now, in one of his works, which is called The Antiquities of the Jews, he has the same longer begetting ages of these men that we looked at in Shem's genealogy from the Septuagint. Same ages. So prior to the 2nd century AD, we have 6 total witnesses, and all 6 testify to the longer chronology. We are completely empty-handed of any witnesses to the smaller numbers found in Genesis 11 of the Masoretic text for Arphaxad to Nahor. So what do we do with this? This is big. I think it's pretty clear that the Septuagint gives us a closer representation to the correct ages and what Moses, that's the most important part, what Moses originally recorded in Genesis. And since we know that Moses got those numbers from God himself, I think we can all agree that the numbers God originally gave Moses were perfectly accurate. And so any resource that can get us closer to those original numbers is extremely valuable. And I believe the Septuagint Genesis is such a resource. Let's look at one more piece of evidence. This is now internal evidence. And internal evidence means it's going to be an internal argument from the Bible itself. We're not going to go outside the Bible, showing that the longer chronology is most likely the correct one. We learn something interesting about Abraham in Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 and 8. Genesis 25, 7 and 8 tells us, "This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." This brings us back to the end of Shem's genealogy in Genesis 11, which ended with Terah begetting Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, right? And if you recall, we looked at a graph of these men's lives, which we will look at again right now. So this is Abraham at the bottom of the chart that you are looking at. By the way, Noah, the father of Shem, is not on this chart. But according to the Masoretic chronology, Noah died at the age of 950, just 2 years before Abraham was born. 2 years before Abraham was born. And again, I think Noah lived to 950. Now, If you remember, we looked at this peculiarity that Abraham lived concurrently with his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Shem, and he lived at the same time as his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Arphaxad, and his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Shelah. And then we also looked at this other peculiarity that his great-great-great-great-grandfather Eber actually outlived Abraham, as you can see here on this chart. And then not to mention Abraham's father Terah and his great-grandfather Serug and his great-great-grandfather Reu, who all lived at the same time as Abraham, they all died over 200 years of age. Keep this in mind. If this timeline is accurate, and I don't think it is, if this timeline from the Masoretic text is accurate, why would Abraham be described in Genesis 25:8 as dying in a good old age, as an old man, and full of years? That doesn't make any sense. These relatives of his that lived during his lifetime, they were living into their 400s. Shem made it to 600 and died just 25 years before Abraham died, and Eber was still alive at 464 years old when Abraham breathed his last. If this timeline is true, Abraham was surrounded by not only these men that were living to these ages, but their other sons and daughters, which the Bible mentions, many of which it would seem must have lived into their 400s and 500s, and maybe even into their 600s as well. And again, I'm not challenging that these men lived that old. I'm challenging the timeline, as we're about to see. So yes, an age of 175 seems old to us today, but we have to take these numbers in the context of that time. Let me make this analogous to today, okay? And this really does work. Imagine throughout your life, you attended a bunch of funerals of family members, and they all lived to their 90s, and one of them made it past 100. That's easy to imagine, right? And then you die some short time later at 35. Would your epitaph read that you died in a good old age as an old man and full of years? I don't think so. Your death would probably, in that context, be considered a tragedy, and everyone would be mourning the fact that you died so young and that you didn't get to live a full life expectancy. By the way, that's exactly what is the case with Abraham, with these other ages. So I plotted out the ages of these men from the Septuagint in Excel as well, and I want you to visually see what this looks like compared to the Masoretic. So again, here is the chart from the Masoretic. Now compare this to the chart from the Septuagint. Sure looks much more normal to me. You still see the gradual reduction in age after the flood, but you don't have great-great-great-great-grandfathers outliving their great-great-great-great-grandsons. And if lifespans were gradually reducing, which I think is accurate, when Abraham makes it to 175, it's correct to say he lived to a good old age and full of years. Think about it. No one would have Noah on their mind at Abraham's death anymore because he's been deceased for almost 1,000 years at that time, according to the Septuagint chronology. And no one would have Shem on their mind either, as he died nearly 800 years prior. And Eber, who our English Bibles say was still alive at 464 when Abraham died, in the Septuagint timeline, he passed about 400 years prior. so will. What do we do with this? What does this all mean? Well, it means one thing, first and foremost, and this is the point that I want to get across to everyone. The Septuagint needs to be considered a valid resource when studying the Bible and when we are in search for what the original manuscripts stated. We have strong evidence, very strong, I would consider it overwhelmingly strong evidence that the genealogies in Genesis chapter 11 more accurately are more accurately represented in the Greek Septuagint as compared to the Hebrew Masoretic. And if the Septuagint is more accurate here in Genesis 11, it's likely to be more accurate in other places as well. The second thing, which I think is super important, is this affects potentially the age of the earth. If we start with a timeline based on the Masoretic text, we come up with a creation date of about 4004 BC. And so if you've heard, and I'm sure you have, that the earth is approximately 6,000 years old, that is exactly where that date came from. You add 2023 years, which is this year, 2023, to 4004 BC, and you get 6,027 years from creation to today. In the 1600s, there was a man in Ireland, from Ireland named James Ussher, and he started to research church fathers, chronology, and the calendar. And in 1650, he published something called the Annals of the World, where he showed his own calculations based on the Genesis chronologies, and he declared in his book that creation happened on October 22nd, 4004 BC. And ever since he published that book, creationists and Christians have been using that date as to why they believe the earth is approximately 6,000 years old. Now guess what? James Ussher was using the dates in the Masoretic text. And so because of what we have discovered with the dates in the Septuagint, I do think his conclusion of a creation date of 4004 BC was incorrect. And I guarantee you that there have been so many times where men, and I get it, we're all human, we all do this, where men began with a date in their mind of around 6,000 years for the age of the earth, and then they tried to fit evidence that they were looking at into that time frame. Guarantee you this has happened. This could be in the field of astronomy, this could be in archaeology, this could be in the field of history, and of course, this has happened in the field of science. Based on the Septuagint chronology, which I now believe is the correct chronology, the creation date would be 5,554 BC. 5554 BC, and that's over 1,500 years older than claimed by many young earth creationists today. And so, this would put the age of the earth at over 7,500 years old. Now, fear not, I still consider myself a young earth creationist, and obviously these 1,500 years are nothing to divide over. But as you will see in the future, I'm bringing people in for this, so this is not going to happen next week. As you will see, now having an older age of the earth is going to make things in astronomy and archaeology and science make way more sense. Let us pray. Father in heaven, come to you today and just so thankful again for your word. We believe that you gave us your word and that you have taken measures throughout history to preserve your word. A lot of people think that that means you preserved it in a single manuscript, but that's just not the case. But we have so many manuscripts that have been preserved throughout time. It's almost miraculous that we have so much text from thousands of years old that we still have access today, and we're continuing to discover new manuscripts. And I pray that we take this information and help us care to know exactly what it is you gave us and what it is that it says and how it's going to affect our lives. And I also pray that we can use this information to hopefully create a bridge with those people that reject you and that reject creation, and that you gave us this universe, and hopefully create a bridge to start conversations with them and get them to open their eyes to see the truth that you are the creator and they will one day have to face you. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.